watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink.
And this is episode 11, continuing our series Rock and Reel, cult music films of the 60s and 70s. This time we'll be discussing The Who's 1975 rock opus, Tommy.
We are proud to announce a truly outstanding rock opera film, Tommy. Director Ken Russell and producer Robert Stigwood have made a film of Tommy and assembled some of the greatest names in music and the cinema. Tommy by The Who and based on the rock opera by Peter Townsend stars Anne Margaret, Oliver Reed, Jack Nicholson, Elton John, Eric Clapton, Tina Turner, Roger Daltrey as Tommy. Don't miss Tommy, the film. Your senses will never be the same again.
So, Tommy from 1975, directed by Ken Russell, starring Roger Daltrey as well as other members of The Who. It goes along with The Who's album, which came out, I believe, 6 years earlier. Yes, 6 years earlier in 1969. And it tells the story of a young boy whose father is thought to be killed in war. His mother, the young boy's mother, remarries. But then when it turns out that the father was not dead, he returns home, and the mother's new husband kills him with a lamp. The young boy, Tommy, sees the whole incident take place, and his stepfather says to him, "You didn't hear it, you didn't see it, and you won't say nothing to no one." Tommy takes that directly to heart and becomes deaf, dumb, and blind.
Quite literally, yes.
Quite literally, yeah.
So that's how the film starts out, and from there, the mother, who's played by Anne Margaret, who gives a very good performance, which we're going to talk about later, but her and the new man in her life try to get Tommy out of this state that he's in by different means, and bringing him to different places and also bringing him to different doctors, one of them being Jack Nicholson, who seems to show up a lot around this time, which we discussed last time.
Yep, everywhere.
Yeah, which I'm fine with.
Yeah, same. No. I wish he was showing up more now.
Exactly, yeah. I miss him.
Yeah.
So they bring him to different doctors, and there are lots of differences between this film and the album that came out before it, and also the stage musical, which actually didn't come out until 1993, so much after this movie. We are going to focus primarily on the album and the movie just because they're a little closer together, a little more directly linked, I think. So do you want to, should we discuss more of the plot, or should we go right into what the differences were?
Yeah, I think you can go right into the differences for now,
right.
Just in case there's anyone coming at this having just heard the album and never seen the movie.
Sure. So if you're familiar with the original album, Tommy by The Who, there are lots of differences. Some of them work, actually, I think, pretty well. Some of them, not so much. So for one, the main difference is that the timeline is different. The setting when the story takes place is a bit different. So the album Tommy takes place around World War I, and the film takes place around World War II. So Tommy's father fights in World War II in the film. And so there's differences, like the song 1951 in the film is actually 1921 on the album. So that's one of the main differences. And I think if you're familiar with the album, it's interesting to see, how the differences play out, what they add or take away from the story. I mean, obviously, if you listen to the album, it's a little bit more cryptic, as rock opera albums can be. So you get some semblance of a storyline, but you're maybe not completely sure. So the movie does flesh things out a little bit more and makes certain things clearer and puts you in that time and place a little bit better. So I think for that, definitely worth checking out. But I do think, just personal opinion, I think the songs on the album are a little stronger. Mostly because it's Roger Daltrey and Pete Townsend singing much of it, whereas in the film you have actors and actresses singing over the songs, which sometimes works pretty well. Actually, I thought Jack Nicholson did a pretty good job.
Yeah. Well, also when you get Tina Turner and Eric Clapton doing their thing, that's also a
you
nice
have Elton
little
John
treat.
in there. Yeah, I mean you have
Elton John,
you have fun cameos like that. And for the most part, it does work. I think certain songs are stronger on the album, but that's just the nature of what they were trying to do. So yeah, that's just a little hint at what the differences were. Also, they added lots of songs and segments in the film that were not on the album, and vice versa. So lots of moving around of the songs as well. The order is a little bit different. So yeah, it's there's lots of differences to point out there.
Yeah, and I think it's the big one obviously we pointed out was the change in the time frame, that it's post World War II.
Yeah.
I think actually it does a lot of good things for the movie. Because one thing and there's one scene in particular featuring Eric Clapton, and there's kind of in this church.
Yeah,
is the best way to describe it.
Very bizarre
but
scene.
It's kind of like a church of pop culture, where the image
Monroe.
that they seem to worship is Marilyn Monroe, which obviously would not have worked had this been set in a post World War I setting.
Also, this movie is just very 70s. I mean, all over it.
Yeah.
Obviously, because it was made in the 70s, but I mean, like scenes like that and the scenes with Elton John and stuff. I mean, there's no way that could be set any other time.
It feels very tied to the time period. Yeah. And for me too, obviously the big song from this entire thing was Pinball Wizard, was kind of the biggest one that everyone knows.
Yeah.
I found myself humming it, and a friend of mine who I never in a million years would have suspected to ever have listened to The Who started singing along. So it is this thing where it's kind of deeply ingrained in popular culture here. And so, like, for example, pinball is something that I wouldn't associate with, the 1920s or the 1930s. I associate it with kind of this hippie or post-hippie generation, as well as, obviously a lot of the clothing, the style, the style of filmmaking, obviously harkening back to Head, which we talked about last week. In this film, you see some really interesting, kind of vaguely reminiscent of French New Wave cutting and jump cuts and
interesting editing.
Very interesting editing and stylistic things that feel very tied to the time. So for me, the decision to push this to a post World War II, I think there's also just a certain neurosis that comes along with knowing about the atomic bomb that seems very weirdly connected to this movie that I can't quite place, because I don't believe that it's ever talked about it, but there does seem something kind of frantic in a way that you might see in those 1950s B horror flicks like Them or something like that, where there's this kind of intense neurosis where things are spiraling out of control. Especially in the Anne Margaret character, who seems to have the most intense neurosis about it. And I think for her it's a little bit of a guilt trip. But she really, really loses her shit in a way that I can't imagine most people doing unless there was some kind of... She's like borderline possessed in the way she loses it here.
Yeah, I wanted to focus on her performances. I want to talk about the performances in general, especially because there's so many cameos and, there's band members like Roger Daltrey and Pete Townsend and the rest of the Who actually shows up in different roles, just, minor roles and stuff like that. But I want to focus on her performance in particular because I just was really, I had seen this film not too long ago, but I revisited it for this, and just watching it again, she's kind of what holds everything together in a weird way. She kind of sells the whole thing, I think. She's able to project so much emotion with, only the words that she's lip syncing and her facial expressions. And I found her pretty impressive in this role. What would you think of her?
Yeah, I loved her in this role. I thought she brought a good dramatic edge to the film. It was, something because, for how, even though the content, the subject matter is kind of absurdist, it is heavy stuff. And I think that in certain situations, when you're dealing with the non-actors being on screen in the way they were, it didn't quite hit the deep dramatic core that it needed to. But I think with Anne Margaret, it went there and beyond. She has like these dark kind of deep set eyes that just have this sheer horror. She throws her body around kind of like a rag doll, which is interesting for her. I mean, I haven't seen too many Anne Margaret movies. But she was in a couple Elvis films that I
Hmm.
like Viva Las Vegas, and I believe Bye Bye Birdie.
Hmm.
And she normally plays these kind of more chipper, sweet, all American girls. So it was really cool to see her in this, just totally, losing her shit
Yeah.
and pushing herself that way.
And it's interesting because at the same time she's playing Tommy's mother, Nora,
Hmm.
who is the grounding presence, in Tommy's life and in the film, but she's so out of control half the time that it does make an interesting contrast, I think.
Hmm.
Especially in the scene. I mean, I guess we can start talking about that scene because we're both thinking of it probably. The
Hmm.
scene where is probably the most memorable moment of the movie when she's as Nora the mother, she's in front of the TV screen watching her son, and uh, eventually different things start to come out of the screen
Hmm.
and all over her, including soap bubbles, uh, baked beans, and chocolate, I believe.
Hmm.
And
Yeah, I'm
so
not exactly sure. Some
they,
kind of
I
brown
had to look it up
substance.
because at first I wasn't even sure. Yeah, so I
Hmm.
did look that up. Yeah, it's supposed to be chocolate, and I guess it's supposed to be like commercials, so coming right out of the TV.
Mm.
So
Interesting.
sort of a surrealistic
Hmm.
moment there where it kind of douses her and she's writhing around in it, and I think that's what you're referring to when she really
Hmm.
goes for broke here in this role,
Hmm.
and I think that's a really interesting scene.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. No, I think it's cool. Also, I'm thinking of the scene where she's, which I think is pretty close to that other moment we're talking about, where she's thinking about like there's a mirror,
Hmm.
and she's thinking about smashing it with a bottle, and
Hmm.
she's dressed in all white and just looks totally run down. And for me, that is kind of where the film peaked.
Hmm.
I think personally, I was much more into the first
Hmm.
half of the film
Hmm.
than I was into the second.
That's a good
Which
segue actually, because we haven't really discussed what ends up happening. Did you want to
Mhm.
go into eventually what where the film kind of leads us?
Yeah, so we can talk about where it goes. So once again, full spoiler warning here.
Yeah.
But the film kind of takes a direction where Tommy, um, through some unforeseen circumstances, discovers that he can play pinball particularly well, despite the
Mm.
fact that he's deaf, dumb, and blind.
And I am
Um,
gonna just jump in here for a second because I don't want to interrupt you, but you mentioned pinball before, and I will have to say I did have to look it up because I was like, wait, was pinball around at this time, at the time of the
yeah,
album? Because the album takes place right after World War I, and I didn't realize, but actually it was around.
was it around?
It
Yeah.
wasn't as prominent, and it wasn't really electronic yet or anything like that, obviously, but it did have deep, yeah. So it goes back further than you realize, but yeah. Anyway, obviously, like the '70s, it was way more prominent, and
It was
yeah,
huge.
yeah.
Especially, I mean, talk about like a movie like Dazed and Confused. The kids are playing pinball all the
Oh
day.
yeah,
It was
it's
clearly the,
staple of the arcades. Yeah. So
it's like which came first, the chicken or the egg? Did Tommy popularize pinball, or did
yeah,
Tommy happen
that's a
because
good
pinball is
question. Yeah.
popular? The annals of pinball. But nevertheless, so he discovers that he can play pinball. Because of that, he seems to get this following. There's this big number with Elton John,
Hmm.
where he's playing in front of a crowd, and Tommy gets
With
this following.
very large shoes. in that
Yeah,
scene.
very large shoes, very large, all very surreal, kind of a Mad Hatter kind of vibe.
Yeah.
So Tommy gets his following, and eventually at some point he sees the specialist played by Jack Nicholson who says that it's all in his head. He actually is able to
Hmm.
hear, he can see all that. He has
He
this,
smashes a mirror.
yeah,
Yeah.
he smashes a mirror. He goes right through it. Well, his mother, I believe, pushes him through the
Right.
mirror,
Right.
if I'm not mistaken. At which point it seems to shock him back to his senses,
Hmm.
and all of a sudden he can see,
He's
he can
riding a hang
hear,
glider.
he
He's.
can talk, and he starts out. He's singing. He sings the song, "I'm Free,"
Hmm.
which is interesting because we were talking before briefly about the kind of strange cultural impact of this film, or if not the film, the album, and how it hung around. And recently, so we're recording this here in mid July. An album came out a few weeks ago or a month ago. It's by Kanye West and Kid Cudi called "Kids See Ghosts," and there's a
Hmm.
song called "Free." Which pretty much uses a very similar intonation and keeps repeating like in the Kid Cudi song. It's like I feel free, and it's a kind of very similar thing, which I
Do
can't
they
help.
sample this song or I
They
haven't
don't
heard it?
sample it, but I can't help but feel like
Mm.
I mean, maybe it's just coincidence or zeitgeist or something like that,
Yeah.
but like I can't help but feel like knowing how both of those artists pull from,
Hmm.
kind of 20th century music and art,
Hmm.
that it has something to do with it.
Right.
So this this music in this film is still really relevant today.
Hmm.
Um, which is odd because also with the film. So I think for me, I think it would probably come more to the music.
Hmm.
The staying power that this has. I think it's an interesting film to examine,
Hmm.
but I don't think that I think at its core the thing that makes it really special is the music.
Hmm.
Because like honestly, I'm not sure I know anyone outside of you, Mark, who's actually sat down and watched Tommy in its entirety. Like
Really?
it's one of those things
Wow.
where like I don't know, like I mean I probably do, but it's one of those things where
Yeah.
there's an awareness of it,
Hmm.
and everyone kind of they've heard of the film, they know it's a film,
Yeah.
but not that many people have actually like
Yeah.
sat down and watched it. They know the
Definitely. Yeah.
music,
No.
they've seen a
Yeah.
clip.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
so I
a
think it
yeah.
kind of gives it this like mythic, almost like Pink Floyd's The Wall,
Hmm.
where a lot of people know it, but not everyone has necessarily seen it.
Yeah,
Um,
it's not for everyone to kind of sit down and take in the entire thing in one sitting. That's for sure. I mean, it is. We talked about this a little bit before we recorded, but it's not the best of the films we've talked about. I mean, there's definitely lots of issues with it. It probably goes on a little bit too long, and
yeah.
some of the songs they extended out, like the Acid Queen song goes on. I thought way too long, but
Mhm.
so things like that kind of weigh it down. But I
But it
think
is a great sequence. The
yeah.
acid
Oh
queen
yeah,
sequence is
definitely.
amazing.
And I think yeah, like the editing keeps it interesting, and there are some interesting visuals, like with the Marilyn Monroe and the TV scene, and
The Iron Maiden of needles.
yeah, lots of crazy off the wall
Mm-hmm.
stuff. So I mean, there's enough in it to keep you interested. But I agree. I think maybe watching scenes from it, you can kind of get the same idea,
Mm-hmm.
in certain ways. And I hate to say that because I'm all for watching taking in the full film and all of that, but I mean
Yeah.
for this movie I feel like it's okay.
They kind of feel like and maybe this is what makes it innovative, but also makes it not necessarily as strong as they kind of feel more like music videos.
Right, at a
If you
time where those
watch,
didn't really exist, so
yeah, like talking about like A Hard Day's Night, that feels like a film. Like even though
right.
there are segments where there's music playing, like
Hmm.
it feels like I don't even want to say a narrative through line, but like a stylistic
Hmm.
and ideological through line.
Hmm.
Whereas this one, I feel like it's maybe best consumed out of order, and you just take in the sequence with Elton John, and you just take in
Hmm.
the I'm free sequence and the Tina Turner bit,
Hmm.
um, and then they're maybe stronger that way.
Hmm. And whereas the last two films we talked about, I would say those were films first and that had music in them or were
Mm-hmm.
featured in them. This one is very much a musical. I mean, it's wall to wall
Opera,
music.
yeah.
There's not one moment, something like Les Mis where there's very little, if any, spoken dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
So did that work for you here, or you think maybe it was a little too much?
Um, I mean, I think it worked for me. I think that what I would have maybe have been interested in seeing, and obviously, if you're gonna go for the idea, go for it. But might have been curious to kind of see more, not necessarily dialogue, but just like really like let the visuals
Hmm.
do their thing. Maybe have some more like in the way of diegetic sound where it can kind of just play, not necessarily characters speaking.
Mm.
But it felt like you said, like to me, the visual pretty much always felt like it was coming second, even if there were some pretty shocking, interesting visuals. The thing that sticks with me, and maybe it's just a testament to the music as well,
Hmm.
the thing that sticks with me is more the sonic end of it
Hmm.
than the movie end of it.
Hmm. And also part of that maybe was because Roger Daltrey is playing the lead role. Maybe he didn't want to try to act necessarily. He
Yeah,
maybe wanted to sing a little bit more. Who
yeah,
knows? I mean, who knows why they did it? Maybe they just wanted to let the songs play out and have that be the film. I mean, who knows? I mean, it might have been a decision by Ken Russell.
yeah.
And, there could be lots going into that, but I think, yeah, if you take it in chunks, almost like music videos, I think it works just as fine that way.
Yeah.
Comparing this to the other films we talked about so far, obviously this is pretty different.
Hmm.
Something we talked about with the other films is that we saw them as autobiographical in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
Do you find that this film plays into that? Do you think there's any commentary on stardom or celebrity like the other films you looked at?
I think maybe there is. I was thinking about this before we talked a little bit. I think that there is something there. I think, for me, you think of like the idea of the artist who kind of has something great and they're holding it in or not able to put it out into the world. So to me, that might be the kind of metaphor with Tommy being deaf, dumb, and blind, and it,
Hmm.
maybe from a childhood trauma.
Hmm.
And at some point, they're finally able to open up and release it into the world.
Hmm.
But then, as we see, the world does with it what it chooses. So I
Right.
think that there maybe is a metaphor there. I mean, personally, I don't know enough about Roger Daltrey's life, or I mean, I know a decent amount about the history of the Who, but like I don't really see it connecting to their journey because from what I understand, they all were pretty well known, pretty young. It didn't seem like there was like a long struggle of inner solitude or
Well, I
anything
do
like
think
that.
I think there are elements of Tommy the album, especially which are
Hmm.
very. I think they're personal to Pete Townsend primarily, who wrote
Did he write? Yeah.
most of it, if not all of it. Actually, would have to double check that. But I was reading up on this a little bit, and there's songs about like not too many touch on it, but there's some about like abuse or
Hmm.
both violent and like sexual abuse. And obviously, he's come out and said he's talked about that a little more recently. So there's elements of that, which I think are kind of deep seated and interesting to think about.
Hmm.
But definitely, I mean, as far as the other films we talked a lot about Stardom and them seeing themselves through this prism of what that's like. And I think that Stardom does play a role in this film. Obviously, I mean, Tommy becomes a star. He's a pinball wizard.
Hmm.
He actually eventually, we didn't get to this in the description of the plot, but he essentially is the leader of a cult by the end of it.
Hmm.
And so there's also themes of martyrdom,
Hmm.
and so Tommy ends up becoming. I saw it as like a self-righteous leader of a cult.
Hmm.
I actually saw it as a critique on organized religion a little bit too.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I could
I
see
don't know
it.
if you got any of that, but yeah.
Well, I
And,
think that there are definitely some critiques on religion. Obviously,
mhm,
and there's the bit where people are wanting to get more out of it,
right.
and they're kind of
And
blaming
and they don't
Tommy.
like the answers that he has, and
Yeah,
it's
so
not
I think
enough
there
for
is a
them.
critique on religion. Also, obviously, the church scene. To go back, I think the
Right.
church scene was probably my favorite sequence.
Hmm.
Just because of all the performers in this movie. Eric Clapton is my favorite. I love Clapton.
Yeah.
But B, just the imagery there, the Marilyn Monroe, and this idea of worshiping materialism, and the idea also of putting that in a church to say, in my opinion, I think what they're trying to say
Hmm.
is that this worshiping of materialism isn't that different than the worshiping of a god,
Hmm.
or a religious connection. So I think there is some critique there. I just think, for me at least personally, it was just and I can't quite place what it is. It was just kind of hard to connect those dots and really feel it.
Hmm.
Like for some reason, we watched Head. Like it was a much more abstract, kind of strange, out there thing, but
Hmm.
like the moments felt like really genuine
Hmm.
to me. And I think in Tommy, what got me is that certain things felt very genuine and exciting and innovative, but certain things felt kind of like constructed to me.
Yeah,
Um,
I can definitely see that for sure.
which I think maybe comes back to it might be the direction. It might be this disconnect that they're working with music
Hmm.
predominantly that's 6 years old,
Hmm.
and then maybe there had been too much time for it to be interpreted,
Hmm.
and there were already certain connotations connected to it at that point that it wasn't kind of an exploration in the process of creating it.
Hmm.
It could have just been like, this is what we have, and we're gonna build the images that we think work with it well.
Yeah, I mean, you can
Um,
see sort of like a young band getting caught up in creating the story, and and I mean,
mhm,
there's definitely a lot of passion behind it, which I appreciate. I
mhm,
just don't think it all, as you said, like I don't think it all translates that well to the screen.
mhm.
Although if that's how I think we both kind of feel that way, and I think it'd be worth you checking out the film Quadrophenia,
Quadrophenia.
which came out in 1979. It's a British film, and that actually is based on their another rock opera album by them, which came out in 1973 called
Mhm.
Quadrophenia, and
Quadrophenia.
that is that film is a lot more subdued. It's almost like a slice of life kind of a movie, and
Mhm.
the band's not really featured in it at all. It's definitely not much of a musical. There is music in it, but
Mhm.
and I think that'd be worth checking out, especially if you weren't too impressed by Tommy, but you were still interested to see more by the Who,
Yeah.
another take on one of their rock albums, or rock opera albums. The Quadrophenia is worth taking a look at.
Yeah.
So at this point, I just I feel like we discussed the themes of the film and kind of went into a deep dive there. But were there any moments or scenes that stuck out to you that you particularly enjoyed? I know you mentioned the Marilyn Monroe scene.
Yeah, we've kind of hit on a few of them already.
Hmm.
Well, first off, I mean, so as much not that we haven't talked bad about the film per se, but obviously we've talked about how certain things that didn't work as well for us. So for me, the whole first like 45 minutes, I actually really really enjoyed.
Hmm.
It was kind of just the second half that fell off for me. I think maybe having something to do with the fact that Roger Daltrey, like I really liked him in his reserve, Deaf, Dumb, Blind,
Hmm.
thing, kind of just wandering around playing this neutral character.
Hmm.
So the image of him kind of wandering aimlessly was good for me. Then there was also like there was one scene with Tina Turner playing this kind of drug fueled, I don't know, what do we call her, like a witch doctor. What's the
I saw it as
like
a prostitute, but yeah, I mean, maybe,
yeah, she's
also
it's
like a
kind of hard to
drug
explain.
dealer kind of. Yeah,
Yeah,
there's a lot going on there.
there's this moment where she puts Tommy in some kind of Iron Maiden with a bunch of syringes
Yeah,
instead of blades.
yeah,
And something about that image was really
yeah. That was really
spectacular to
strong
me.
imagery. Yeah.
And then I think that's a lot of this. So there were a lot of really good singular images.
Hmm.
I just had a kind of hard time connecting them and
Yeah.
figuring out how they were working together and what story they were telling.
Totally, and I agree. I think the first half of the film's a lot stronger than the second half, and I think part of that is because, like I said, I feel like it goes on a little too long. But
Hmm.
also that opening montage is like, I don't know. I was captivated by it. I don't know
Hmm.
why. Like I had seen the film before, but for some reason, watching that opening montage
Hmm.
again, that's like it kind of sets the whole scene with the overture playing over it, and
Yeah.
it's all music. There's no dialogue at all there, no singing or anything, and it's just like these images, and it's giving you lots of information. But the way it does it, it's just I thought it was very well done, and yeah, it brings you into the world, and I think that first half you're kind of with it, and then after that it kind of drops off a bit. It almost becomes a little hokey, I think, at
Yeah.
that point. I mean, I guess that's what they were kind of going for with Tommy starting his cult and whatnot,
Yeah.
but
Well, and it might be perspective too.
yeah,
I suppose
it
how
becomes a
long
bit
ago
like
are we
a bit
talking?
yeah, it becomes a bit kitschy. I thought
Yeah, but in 1975, it might not have
right,
felt that way. I
exactly,
mean, we're
yeah.
talking around the same time that people had, brown and tan pattern wallpaper, and it was a different, certain things stylistically
Definitely, yeah.
connected more, but to contemporary viewers who we've seen Thriller and we've seen Lemonade, and we've gotten to experience this idea of like the music video now coming in as its own like art for like its own like long form
Hmm.
art.
Hmm.
Um, I think that looking back at this, this was a kind of really primitive example of it.
Hmm.
And what I actually I like to talk about a lot is like Citizen Kane, where it's an amazing movie, but kind of what it did for movies, I think, is what's most amazing about it.
Yeah, the
I know
techniques that were used, yeah.
the techniques that were used and some of the risks that they took, and I think that Tommy might be one of those films where like what it did in terms of breaking ground on the music video genre
Yeah.
is really important, but to sit down and just watch it with the expectation of what it is,
Hmm.
it might not quite come across in the way that you would hope.
Yeah, I would say it doesn't work as a film as much as the last two films that we talked about.
Hmm.
But take it in chunks, take it, certain scenes like we talked about can be more effective, I think.
Would you consider Tommy must see watching? Must watch?
I, mm, Good question. I would not say must watch. I would say if you're at all interested in the rock opera as an art form, or the Who, or musical films in general, I think it'd be worth checking out. I think
Mm-hmm.
anyone else, it may be a little rough to get through. It definitely, I mean, there's lots of cult aspects. I mean, we're obviously talking about cult films here, and I
Mm-hmm.
think just how bizarre and strange some of the scenes are. Like you mentioned that Iron Maiden scene, it's I think just for that like kind of like wow factor, I think there's a lot there that would be worth checking out. But as a film, not the strongest.
Mm-hmm.
Not the story is not maybe not as fleshed out as you would like it to be, but you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So my final take on it would be this film, maybe not for everyone, but if you enjoy The Who or intrigued by the idea of a lavish rock opera with
Mm-hmm.
some interesting visuals, I mean, it's worth taking a look at. And also to see the various cameos and the differences between this and the original album if you're at all interested in that. And like I said, it did make a stage musical from this. Pete Townsend did that. I believe it was 1993. It was when it opened, and that was also a bit different from the album and the film. So if
Mm-hmm.
you are interested to take a look at all the differences, if you're that inclined, there are lots of them. So,
Yes.
but we won't go into that here. Did you have any final takes on Tommy?
Yeah, I mean, I would be curious. I'm always experimenting with how I watch things, but at this point, I've already seen it straight through as a movie. I would say, I don't know, same thing. I wouldn't know if I'd call this a must watch, but what I would say is an interesting thing to experiment, which maybe this is sacrilege to say it, would be, we're in an age where you can get clips online so easily that, maybe check out a few clips. The two actually that I would recommend would be Eyesight to the Blind, which features Eric Clapton. That's that church sequence we're talking about with Marilyn Monroe. And then the Acid Queen with Tina Turner. And actually, I know I said two, but I would also, of course, look up Pinball Wizard just because it's a classic. And if you haven't seen it, that is absolutely must watch, just as in your education as a film viewer.
Yes, you have our permission to look up clips of this film.
Yes.
Cult Movie Cult has said that it's okay.
We put our official seal on it.
It is okay.
It is okay.
Yeah, but that's about it, right? Nothing much else to say about this one. But we have one more film that we're going to talk about. And Jeremy, what is that film?
That film is going to be Rock and Roll High School, featuring the Ramones.
Yes. So that's going to round out our series, the rock and roll series that we're currently doing here. Thank you for listening to Cult Movie Cult. You can find us on iTunes and Podbean, as well as on social media, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, please feel free to reach out at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. And join us next time for the Ramones and Rock and Roll High School. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.